When we think about hearing loss, our minds usually jump straight to a hearing aid, right? But what happens when the problem isn't just about volume? What if the very part of your ear that's supposed to process sound is, well, broken? Today, we're going to dive deep into the incredible world of advanced hearing implants. Technology that doesn't just make things louder, it literally finds new ways for the brain to hear.
And that's really the big question here. For so many people, just cranking up the volume is completely useless. I mean, it's kind of like shouting at a radio that's not even plugged in. The issue isn't how loud the signal is, it's that the receiver itself is offline. And that's exactly where the real innovation kicks in.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at why your standard hearing aid sometimes just doesn't cut it. Then, we'll get into the amazing cochlear implant and a pretty intense race against time for some patients. We'll even look at tech that bypasses the ear completely, sending sound through your bones or directly to your brain. Oh, and you're going to want to stick around for the end because our last point reveals something totally counterintuitive about who this technology actually helps the most.
All right, let's start at square one. Before we jump into all the really advanced stuff, we've got to understand why the most common solution, the hearing aid, sometimes isn't a solution at all.
A standard hearing aid is at its core a tiny personal sound system. It's got a microphone to grab the sound, an amplifier to juice it up, and a little speaker to pump that louder sound into the ear. But the whole thing is built on one big assumption, that the inner ear is actually ready and able to do its job with that amplified sound.
And right here, this is the fatal flaw. A hearing aid is basically useless if the part of the inner ear that converts sound vibrations into electrical signals for the brain, this thing called the organ of Corti, is damaged. If that critical piece is broken, making the sound louder is like screaming into a dead microphone. You can shout all day, but nothing's getting through.
So, if you can't fix the broken receiver, what do? Well, you just bypass it. And that brings us to the cochlear implant, which is a total game changer in hearing technology.
This slide lays out the difference perfectly. A hearing aid assists a damaged ear. It gives it a boost. A cochlear implant, on the other hand, replaces the function of that damaged part. It creates an entirely new pathway for sound to get to the brain. It's a fundamentally different strategy.
So how in the world does it work? It's a pretty incredible process. There's an external processor that picks up sound and turns it into a digital signal. That signal gets sent wirelessly, right through the skin, to a receiver implanted inside. From there, tiny electrical pulses travel down an array of electrodes that have been carefully threaded into the cochlea. And this is the magic part. Those electrodes directly zap the auditory nerve, sending the info straight to the brain to be understood as sound.
So who's a candidate for something like this? The criteria are really specific. It's for people who have severe to profound hearing loss in both ears. And it has to be what's called sensory neural loss, which means the damage is in that inner ear. And most importantly, it's for folks who get almost no benefit from even the most powerful hearing aids.
But here's the thing. It's not just about meeting the medical criteria. Timing is absolutely everything. For some patients, getting an implant is a literal race against the clock.
And there are two of these incredibly critical windows. For a child born deaf, their brain's language centers are just exploding with development. Getting an implant before they're 18 months old is just crucial for them to develop speech and language normally. But then look at this other way. For someone who loses their hearing after getting meningitis, the window is shockingly tight, just 1 month.
Why so urgent? Well, meningitis can trigger this condition where the soft, hollow parts of the cochlea start to ossify. They literally turn to solid bone. And if that happens, there's just nowhere for the surgeons to place the implant's electrodes. That window of opportunity physically slams shut, and it's permanent.
Okay, but what if the problem is even deeper than the inner ear? A cochlear implant works by stimulating the auditory nerve. So what happens if that nerve, the very cable connecting the ear to the brain, is missing or broken?
This is where we step into a whole new world with the Auditory Brainstem Implant, or ABI. If a cochlear implant takes a detour around the inner ear, the ABI takes it a massive leap further. It bypasses both the inner ear and the auditory nerve, placing its electrodes directly onto the brainstem itself.
Yeah, this is the solution for some of the most complex cases you can imagine. We're talking about patients whose auditory nerve just never formed or was destroyed by a tumor. For these people, a cochlear implant would be pointless because there's simply no nerve for it to stimulate. The ABI creates the ultimate workaround.
So far, we've been all about bypassing broken parts on the inside. But what if the inner ear is working perfectly, and the problem is just getting the sound to it in the first place? Well, that calls for a totally different strategy.
taking an alternate route. So, meet the bone-anchored hearing aid, or BAHA. Instead of trying to send sound through the ear canal, this device is anchored directly to the bone of your skull. It vibrates, and those vibrations travel right through your bone to your perfectly good inner ear. It literally uses your skull as a speaker.
Now, the key here is that a BAHA is for what's called conductive hearing loss. This is when the inner ear is fine, but something is physically blocking the sound from getting there, like if someone was born without an ear canal. The BAHA just creates a brand new path for the sound to complete its journey.
This table is a really great way to sum it all up. You've got the cochlear implant, which bypasses a damaged inner ear. You've got the auditory brainstem implant, which bypasses the cochlea and the nerve. And then you have the BAHA, which bypasses problems in the outer and middle ear. 3 totally different problems, 3 totally ingenious solutions.
And that brings us to our final section, and maybe the most surprising one of all. You might think you know who the ideal candidate for this kind of technology would be, but I think the reality is going to challenge your assumptions. So, let me just ask you straight up, who do you think gets more out of a cochlear implant? A baby who was born completely deaf and is given the gift of hearing for the very first time? Or an adult who heard perfectly for most of their life and then lost it?
I think for a lot of us, our heart immediately goes to the baby, right? I mean, we're giving them an entire sense they never had. It seems obvious. But is it the right answer?
And here's the twist. The ideal candidate is the adult. And the reason why is actually profound. That adult's brain already has a complete blueprint for sound. The speech centers, the auditory pathways, they were all built and perfected over decades of hearing. So when that implant gets turned on, the brain goes, oh, I know what this is, and it knows exactly how to interpret those new signals. For the baby, the implant gives them the raw data, but their brain has to learn what sound is from the ground.
And all of this leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to chew on. We've seen tech that can sidestep our own anatomy to send signals straight to a nerve, or even to the brain itself. As we get better and better at creating these sensory workarounds, it really forces us to ask, what does it truly mean to hear? Is it just about the ear, or is it about the brain's incredible, flexible ability to find meaning in a signal, no matter where that signal comes from? It's a question that really blurs the line between biology and technology. Thanks for exploring it with us.